Welcome to the podcast that is completely dedicated to reconnecting children, families, and the entire human species with the wonders of nature. So open your door, step on outside, and prepare for adventure. This is Nature Kids Radio.
Oh, give me land, lots of land under starry skies above. Don't fence me in. Let me ride through the wide open country that I love. Don't fence me in. Let me be by myself in the evening breeze. Listen to the murmur of the cottonwood trees. Send me out forever, but I ask you please, don't fence me in.
Greetings everyone, and welcome back to Nature Kids Radio. I'm your host, Kenny Ballantyne, the director of Nature Kids and the founder of the Nature Kids Institute, and welcome to Season 2. If you liked what you heard in Season 1, which was only 5 episodes long, then you are in for a treat. Season 2 has 12 powerful episodes all queued up and ready for your listening enjoyment. As always, if you are a fan of the podcast, please let me know by rating and reviewing us on iTunes and by sharing these episodes with those who need to hear it. Today on the podcast, nature deficit disorder. Now, if you haven't heard of this before, it is time that you do. Nature deficit disorder is not an official medical term, although many people believe that it should be. It suggests that there are unavoidable mental and physical consequences to living a life that is indoors and devoid of nature. And I had the privilege of sitting down for a conversation with the man who first coined the term.
I'm Tom Waits. I sing for a living.
He has quite the sense of humor.
I'm Rich Louv, and I wrote 2 books about connecting people to nature. First one was Last Child in the Woods. Second was Nature Principle, and I'm chairman emeritus of the Children in Nature Network.
And you can add to that list his latest book, Vitamin N, The Essential Guide to Leading a Nature-Rich Life, available on Amazon now. Rich's love and passion for nature stems from his childhood, which was largely dominated by time outside, free roaming around in natural spaces.
Well, like many people, I was a kid once, and I spent a lot of time outdoors. In the woods, I lived right on the edge of the suburbs and spent much of my boyhood in those woods with my dog, and they were my woods, and I owned those woods in my heart, and to the extent that as an 8-year-old I pulled out hundreds of survey stakes that I knew had something to do with the bulldozers that were taking out other woods, and I protected my woods. But when I say that I had a sense of ownership of them, sometimes that word is controversial in environmental circles. I owned those woods in my heart, and they owned me. And I knew that, but I couldn't have articulated it. So much of this work really comes from that experience of just knowing what they were to me and what perhaps I was to them.
This kind of outdoor, unstructured childhood was typical throughout, most of human history, but it stands in stark contrast to what we see as the normal, everyday experience of children today.
Well, I think it's pretty obvious to most people that kids are not going outside as much as they did. They're being raised, many of them, in front of televisions and computers and playing video games, and in schools that have canceled recess and canceled field trips, and they're being raised, many of them, under essentially protective house arrest. Now, I want to make clear I'm not anti-tech. Actually, in the new book, in the Nature Principle, I talk about that the more high-tech our lives become, the more we need nature. It's kind of an equation. It doesn't mean the exclusion of technology, but it does mean the balancing of technology with experiences in nature. This is particularly important for kids. And as they get less and less experience in nature, I think it's doing them great harm.
And this is where the idea of nature deficit disorder comes back in. Throughout the rest of this interview and throughout Season 2 of Nature Kids Radio, you're going to hear the dozens, if not hundreds, of consequences that stem from the loss of our human relationship with the natural world. But one of these consequences that specifically affects children is the loss of what is called executive function.
There was a study done recently that replicated a study that was done in the 1940s of what's called executive function. Executive function is that voice inside you that says maybe it's not a good idea to follow your buddies off the cliff. It's essential for people to be independent, to be entrepreneurs, to really be grown-ups, to develop that. Much of that is developed early in childhood in independent make-believe play. And to the extent we're replacing that with supervised play under adult control and electronic play, we're taking away the ability of our kids to learn how to control themselves and to learn to be independent and make decisions. The study that I mentioned that replicated a study that was done in the 1940s, that study shows that a 7-year-old today has the independent executive function of a 5-year-old in the 1940s. In other words, we've sliced away 2 years of development of the ability to control and be our own person from these kids. We're not doing them any favors by supervising every minute of their growing up.
Then, of course, in addition to the consequences of an indoor lifestyle, there are just as many countless examples of benefits that come from spending time outside connected with nature, including benefits to those with learning disabilities.
The symptoms of attention deficit disorder in kids get much better, even kids as young as 5. University of Illinois doing a lot of great research on that. With just a little bit of contact with nature, just a walk through trees in an urban park.
It can also have an impact on your vision.
Studies of myopia, these studies are largely in Australia, have drawn a correlation between how much time kids spend indoors with how bad their eyes are.
Nature also plays a role in your physical fitness.
People in an indoor gym on a treadmill compared to people who are doing green exercise, going on hikes or gardening, something like that. Both groups burning exactly the same number of calories. People on the treadmills, they get healthier, psychological well-being, heart rate, etc. But the people who are doing green exercise outdoors in nature get even better on all those scores, and we don't understand why. There's a value added there to being outdoors in nature that we don't really truly understand.
At this point, you might be asking a question that I hear a lot, and that is, why nature? If my kids are in soccer and baseball, won't they get all the same benefits? Is it really essential that they climb trees and play in the mud?
Good parents want enrichment for their kids. That's the buzzword, enrichment. And it's important. All parents want that, or at least the good ones. It depends on how you define enrichment. I'm not saying soccer is bad. It's great for kids. It does give them physical exercise, etc. But we have to realize that the greatest increase in child obesity in our history occurred during the same 2 decades as the greatest increase in organized sports for children in our history. It's not to say that organized sports are causing that. It's just saying that it's not enough. It's not doing it.
Now, chances are that if you're over 30, you remember a time when it was much easier for children to spend time outside, alone, with a lot more personal autonomy and freedom. Today, on the other hand, you feel like a bad parent if you so much as let your kids out of your sight. So, what happened? Well, according to Rich, the answer lies in our most primal instinct: fear.
Fear, parental fear, is one of the main reasons that kids aren't going outside independently as they did. Now, this is based on repetitive conditioning by CNN and Fox and my profession of journalism, as well as the news media. A handful of terrible crimes against children is repeated again and again and again by the never-ending 24-hour news cycle. And that gives us the impression that there's a lot more stranger danger out there than there actually is. The numbers are quite small compared to what we think they are. Now, one stranger abduction is too many, but compared to what we think they are in most neighborhoods, it's very small. And yet we have this growing fear. This fear also translates into a fear of nature itself. I can't tell you how many times I've heard school teachers or preschool teachers talk about how the parents are just terrified their kids will get muddy. And that fear of nature, you pick up Parade magazine, it's got a raccoon on the covers, danger, danger, neighborhood invaders, dangerous to you, I mean, we've really convinced ourselves that nature is almost as much of a threat as human strangers.
But that's not all we're afraid of. One of the most powerful forces keeping kids inside today is actually the fear of lawyers.
But there's also fear of litigation. I mean, if you think very long about it, if you're thinking about building a treehouse for your kid or having your kids build a treehouse, even better. But in terms of litigation, it's even worse. If you're thinking about doing that, having neighborhood kids come over, if you think about that very long, you won't do it. Now, the truth is that there's insurance you can buy for your treehouse, but people don't know about that. The truth is that nuisance lawsuits are actually at a lower level than they have been, and in fact they're a lot lower than people think they are. But again, it's like stranger danger. People assume that if they sneeze, they'll get sued. So what that translates into also, along with this need to control everything just because of our fear of strangers generally and nature itself, but also the fear of lawyers. Almost every community has been built, residential communities that have been built in the last 30, 35, 40 years are governed by CC&Rs, covenants and restrictions. They have private governments, many of them, particularly the gated communities, these community associations, neighborhood associations, that control the kinds of things in people's lives that we would never allow public government to control. These community associations control everything from the color of your curtain liners to whether you can plant a rose bush in the front yard, let alone a vegetable garden. Horrors. Just try to put up a basketball hoop in some of these neighborhoods, let alone let the kids build a treehouse or a fort like they did for millennia. It's not going to happen. One woman told me that her community association outlawed chalk drawing on the sidewalks, which apparently leads to cocaine addiction. I made that last part up.
There's that sense of humor again. So obviously, fear is a powerful barrier we must overcome to bring childhood back outside. But of course, there are other barriers. Some that quickly come to mind are socioeconomic barriers.
Well, there's clearly socioeconomic obstacles, but it's a little more complicated than what most people think, I think. First, just because you don't live in an inner city doesn't mean you don't have barriers. I mean, some of them include the legal barriers, the control of covenants and restrictions in neighborhoods that don't let kids, you may see a lot of green, but just try to step on it. And the proliferation of electronics. I mean, the Kaiser Family Foundation found that there were, a few years ago, they said that 44 hours a week spent plugged into some kind of electronic medium, most kids. Now it's up to 54. People who updated that study were astounded. They didn't think there were that many more hours in the week that could be dedicated to electronics. So the affluence actually in some ways sets up its own barriers that are just as great as some in the inner city. Now, in inner city, and again, I should say not all inner city neighborhoods are low income. I always have to make that qualification, but the low income inner city neighborhoods, obviously there's barriers. Some of those neighborhoods are unsafe compared to some other neighborhoods. Also, parks have been taken over by gangs, etc. I mean, it's unlikely you're going to have a pleasant nature experience in a park where you're finding hypodermic needles on the ground. So all of that is true. In San Diego, where I live, a study was done of the inner city kids in San Diego and found that 95% of them had never been in a boat. 90% of them did not know how to swim. And 34% had never been to the ocean, and they're less than 20 minutes away from it. Now that may sound outrageous, but I've been in lots of cities around the country where they report something very similar, whether it's mountains in Denver or whether it's the Atlantic Ocean on the East Coast, or even in places like Florida. I mean, you would think in San Diego, a resort city, the kids right next to the ocean would have that experience, but they've literally, some of them, never seen it. They may have seen it in the distance, but they've never touched it.
So next I asked Richard the question I ask everybody, which is, so what can we do about it? What's the solution? What is something we could do today? And the obvious answer is get outside. It's pretty simple. Stop making excuses, put down the phone, and get out there. And that's what most people say. Rich, however, had a very different answer. He suggests that the long-term solution to the human disconnect with nature lies in the way we choose to define our vision of the future.
I'm convinced that most Americans, when they are asked to conjure up images quickly of the far future, the images they will come up with in their mind are ones that look a lot like Blade Runner and Mad Max. A post-apocalyptic future in which nature has either been stripped from human life or so changed, as in the Hunger Games, that it's unrecognizable. And along with that, our own humanity has been stripped from us in that post-apocalyptic future that we tend to imagine in our minds. I'm convinced that environmentalism has done a poor job in describing a different future. Journalism has done a poor job in describing a hopeful future. Martin Luther King demonstrated and said in many ways that any movement, any culture will fail if it cannot paint a picture of a world that people will want to go to. We're not painting that picture of a world that people want to go to. At best, we talk about sustainability, which most people interpret as energy efficiency, as sustaining, as stasis, as not getting worse. No self-respecting creative 16-year-old is interested in stasis. And neither is the 16-year-old creative person inside you. We want to create something new. So what if we started imagining a very different future in which where we live, work, learn, and play is as immersed in nature every day as it is in technology? When I talk to college students about that, they get excited. They want to do that. That's something they can get behind. I sat with some college students a few weeks ago at DePaul University. These are students who are in environmental studies, and they're alienated from mainstream environmentalism. And the main reason is the lack of an image of a good future. A great future, a better future, not just an adequate future. One young woman told me, she said, I'm 21 years old, about to graduate, and my whole life I've been told it's too late, that the game's over. My whole life I've been told the end is near environmentally. That can only be told to someone so many times before they begin to put up blocks to that, before they begin to numb themselves. I think one of our biggest problems really is not the dumbing of America, but the numbing of America, that our image of the future, our inability to describe a great future, a nature-rich future, and to begin to build that, that's numbiness. That's taking away some of our ability to feel alive. The less time we spend in nature, our kids or us, the more numb we feel.
Now, to me, this was a profound concept that nobody seems to really be talking about. When you listen to just about anyone discuss the future, it's always couched in terms of decline, like we're on a sinking ship. One of my favorite examples of this is Tomorrowland at Disneyland.
There's a great, big, beautiful tomorrow
ever since Disneyland opened, up through my childhood, Tomorrowland was filled with attractions that celebrated an optimistic vision of the future. It was all about the ideas that would make the world a better place. It was designed in the 1950s, so they were all excited about plastic, atomic energy, going to the moon, and so on. Today, however, Tomorrowland is very different. It no longer has attractions based on an optimistic vision of the future, because there no longer is an optimistic vision of the future. And as a result, Tomorrowland is now filled with attractions based on science fiction movies, or in other words, escapism, avoiding the conversation about our future altogether. And yet, here's Richard Louv, filled with hope and painting a beautiful vision of a future where life is as immersed in nature as it is in technology. And so I asked, where does this come from? What is it that fills you with hope?
The last line of the nature principle is, there is no practical alternative to hope. I mean, can you think of one? But hope alone won't do it. We do have to take action. We do have to do things. And I'm seeing that happen all over the country. Children nature movement really is an indicator that a bigger movement could occur. Lately, I've been talking a lot about what I call a new nature movement, for lack of a better phrase. New nature movement would be bringing lots of people to the table, lots of people to the cause of the relationship with nature, who don't usually often think of themselves as environmentalists. Physicians, pediatricians who are prescribing nature now, they're part of the movement. Architects, biophilic architects, urban planners who are creating new kinds of ideas for cities, they're part of that movement. Teachers, all of the ways that we can connect to nature for our cognitive and mental health and physical health, there are dozens of careers that could come out of that. If we can build that bigger movement that is far larger than the current environmental movement, then we've got a lot of hope.
There is no practical alternative to hope. Special thanks to Richard Louv for appearing on the program. You have been listening to Nature Kids Radio. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening, everybody. If you enjoyed what you heard here today, please help out the podcast by going over to iTunes, by writing a review, and by giving us a 5-star rating. And if you would like more information on how to connect kids with nature every day, head on over to naturekidsinstitute.com, where you can join our mailing list and also sign up for a free webinar. Until then, I'm Kenny Ballantyne, and I will see you outside.
Give me land, lots of land under starry skies above. Don't fence me in. Let me ride through the wide open country that I love. Don't fence me in. Let me be by myself in the evening breeze. Listen to the murmur of the cottonwood trees. Send me out forever, but I ask you please, don't fence me in. Just turn me